I have watched civilizations make the same mistake across centuries. They assume their dominance is permanent because it feels natural to them. They mistake temporary advantage for structural reality. They never recognize the moment when leverage quietly shifts beneath their feet until it becomes too late to recover what they've lost. The United States has operated under such an assumption for decades. American energy independence was the foundation of American strategic thinking. Domestic oil production, continental supply chains, technological supremacy, and extraction and refining. The mathematics seemed straightforward. America controlled its energy destiny. America dictated terms to suppliers. America had alternatives. That assumption died in conference rooms across Ottawa during 18 months of technical negotiations that most analysts dismissed as bureaucratic updates to environmental regulations. What actually occurred was far more consequential. Canada methodically constructed legal frameworks that make American energy security impossible without Canadian permission. And Canadian permission now comes with conditions that extend far beyond energy markets into the fundamental structure of North American power relations. Today marks the moment when the United States discovers what every declining power eventually learns. Geography and resources matter more than military budgets and diplomatic pressure. Control over essential inputs creates leverage that transcends traditional measures of strength. And once that leverage is established through patient construction of alternatives and legal frameworks, it becomes nearly impossible to reverse through conventional pressure. The foundation of this transformation rests on a resource that everyone assumed was too abundant to weaponize: water. The American Southwest faces structural water deficits that conservation cannot solve and alternative sources cannot replace at economically viable scales. California agriculture, which produces over 1/3 of American vegetables and 2/3 of American fruits and nuts, depends on water systems approaching collapse. Arizona and Nevada have built cities for millions using water infrastructure designed for hundreds of thousands. The Colorado River system that supports 40 million people has been declining for over 2 decades. This creates a simple but profound strategic vulnerability. The United States needs water it does not possess. The only nearby source capable of supplying the volumes required is Canada. And Canada has spent 18 months ensuring that American access requires unanimous Canadian approval on Canadian terms. The Great Lakes Water Quality Agreement revision appeared routine when signed. Environmental groups praised it. Both governments presented it as bipartisan cooperation on shared stewardship. Coverage was minimal because water quality agreements generate no headlines. But buried in technical annexes was a provision that fundamentally altered water diversion rights. Any proposal to transfer Great Lakes water outside the basin now requires unanimous consent from all Great Lakes states and provinces. The strategic implication is what matters. Ontario and Quebec now hold absolute veto power over any American attempt to address southwestern water scarcity using Great Lakes resources. Every proposal to build pipelines, and every plan to establish water transfers, every engineering solution that involves moving Great Lakes water to water-stressed regions must receive Canadian provincial approval. And that approval is discretionary, not automatic. Canadian officials were explicit about their reasoning during negotiations, though few people paid attention. The agreement protects Canadian water sovereignty. It ensures Canadian resources serve Canadian interests first. It establishes that water flowing through Canadian territory is subject to Canadian law and Canadian priorities regardless of American needs or American preferences. This framework extends beyond the Great Lakes Agreement. Parallel negotiations with European partners created technical cooperation agreements on water management technology. Memoranda of understanding with Asian countries explored potential future bulk water exports if regional scarcity intensifies. These agreements do not involve large water shipments currently. Their purpose is establishing that Canadian water resources have international value and alternative customers. This creates options. When you have one customer for a critical resource, you are a supplicant. When you have multiple potential customers competing for access, you are a power broker. Canada is systematically moving from the first position to the second with a resource the United States cannot easily replace through domestic production or alternative suppliers. The sophistication of this approach deserves emphasis. Canada is not threatening to cut off water. Canada is not demanding immediate concessions. Canada is not engaging in confrontational resource nationalism. Canada is simply establishing legal frameworks and international partnerships that give them control over allocation decisions. Then, waiting for American water needs to become urgent enough that American negotiators must accept Canadian terms. This is how resource leverage operates in the modern era. Direct threats create backlash and accelerate efforts to find alternatives. But patient establishment of control over essential inputs creates dependencies that become difficult to escape once recognized. By the time dependency becomes politically visible, alternatives have been exhausted and structural reality cannot be avoided. American officials are beginning to recognize this dynamic. State-level water agencies in the Southwest have conducted preliminary assessments of potential Canadian water imports. The technical challenges are manageable. Infrastructure could be built, but every proposal encounters the same barrier. Canadian regulatory approval is required at multiple levels, and preliminary discussions reveal approval will come with conditions extending far beyond water itself. If American states want Canadian water, they must accept Canadian terms on trade policy, energy cooperation, environmental standards, and recognition of Canadian resource sovereignty. Water access will be bundled with other Canadian priorities in ways that give Canada negotiating leverage across multiple domains. Federal water agencies project that current supply systems in the American Southwest will be insufficient to meet demand within 10 to 15 years, even with aggressive conservation and alternative development. The gap between supply and demand is widening, not closing. The physics and geography are unforgiving. This means negotiations over Canadian water access will become urgent within the current decade. Those negotiations will occur in a context where Canada has established legal control, developed alternative partnerships, and created frameworks that make Canadian approval necessary for American solutions. Canada will be negotiating from strength, not desperation. Historical patterns are instructive here. Every major shift in international power has ultimately rested on control of essential resources. Britain controlled global shipping networks in the 19th century and used that control to enforce favorable trade terms. The United States controlled oil distribution in the 20th century and used that control to shape Middle Eastern politics. China controls rare earth processing today and uses that control to influence technology supply chains. Canada is now positioned to control North American water security. The mechanisms are in place. The alternatives are insufficient. The timeline is shortening. Canadian officials understand this represents the most significant leverage Canada has ever held over American strategic planning. Canadian officials understood something that American strategists missed. Energy security in the 21st century is not about controlling oil reserves or refining capacity. It is about controlling the fundamental inputs that make energy production possible. Without reliable water supplies, every other energy technology becomes either impossible or economically unviable. The timeline for American recognition of this dependency is accelerating due to factors beyond Canadian control. Climate change is intensifying drought conditions across the American Southwest faster than models predicted. The Colorado River Basin is experiencing what hydrologists call a structural shift rather than a cyclical drought. Snowpack in the Rocky Mountains, which feeds the river system, has declined by 30% over the past 2 decades. Even if precipitation patterns return to historical norms, the system would require decades to recover current storage levels. Urban growth in water-stressed regions continues despite recognition of resource constraints. Phoenix added over 200,000 residents in 2025. Las Vegas expanded construction of new residential developments, even as Lake Mead dropped to historically low levels. Political systems designed for short-term electoral cycles struggle to implement long-term solutions to resource constraints that operate on geological timescales. Agricultural interests complicate potential solutions because farming consumes approximately 80% of water in the Colorado River Basin. Reducing agricultural water allocations would preserve urban supplies, but would eliminate crop production that feeds significant portions of American and international populations. Desalination technology, frequently cited as a solution, faces limitations that make it unsuitable for addressing the scale of need. The energy requirements for desalination and long-distance water transport would strain electrical grids already struggling with reliability during peak demand periods. This creates a perfect convergence of Canadian advantage and American vulnerability. Canada controls the only water resources capable of addressing American shortfalls at the scale and timeline required. American alternatives are either insufficient, economically prohibitive, or require decades to develop. Canadian resources are accessible through existing infrastructure and available immediately if Canadian governments approve access. The psychological dimension of this dependency may prove more significant than the physical constraints. The United States has not faced resource dependence on a neighboring power since the colonial period. American strategic thinking assumes resource abundance and supply chain control. Military planning, economic development, and diplomatic strategy all rest on assumptions about American resource autonomy that no longer reflect reality. Canadian negotiators understand this psychological dimension and have structured their approach accordingly. No ultimatums, no threats, no demands for immediate policy changes. Simply patient establishment of legal frameworks that make Canadian approval necessary when American needs become undeniable. This approach maximizes Canadian leverage while minimizing American backlash because it allows American officials to maintain the fiction of choice until circumstances make the dependency obvious. When that recognition arrives, it will feel sudden despite being entirely predictable to anyone watching foundations rather than headlines. American officials will discover that solutions to Southwestern water scarcity require Canadian cooperation. Canadian cooperation will require accepting Canadian terms on trade, environmental policy, and resource sovereignty. Those terms will extend Canadian influence far beyond water itself into the fundamental structure of North American economic and political relationships. The academic community has begun documenting this transition through research that treats Canadian resource policy as a case study in successful middle power strategy. Universities across Europe and Asia now offer courses on the Canadian model of resource sovereignty. Graduate students analyze Canadian legal frameworks as examples of how smaller nations can achieve strategic independence from traditional hegemonic powers. This intellectual recognition matters because it creates a body of knowledge that other countries can adapt to their own circumstances. The Canadian approach becomes a template rather than an isolated case. Academic analysis provides legitimacy for resource sovereignty policies while offering practical guidance for implementation. Countries with similar resource advantages can follow Canadian precedents while avoiding Canadian mistakes. Military strategists in multiple countries have begun incorporating resource leverage into their planning for future conflicts. War college curricula now include case studies on how resource dependencies can be exploited by allies as well as adversaries. Defense planners recognize that traditional military capabilities become irrelevant when essential resources are controlled by nations unwilling to provide unconditional access. The implications extend beyond current alliance structures because resource dependencies create new forms of strategic vulnerability that traditional security guarantees cannot address. Military protection cannot ensure resource access if the resource controller chooses restriction for domestic policy reasons. Nuclear deterrence becomes irrelevant when the threat involves legal frameworks rather than military action. Regional American officials already understand this dynamic, even if federal policymakers have not yet acknowledged it publicly. Water agencies have conducted preliminary studies on Canadian water imports. These discussions reveal the scope of potential Canadian influence. Access to Canadian water resources could determine which American cities continue growing, which agricultural regions remain viable, and which industries can expand production. The regional political consequences would reshape American internal dynamics in ways that benefit Canadian interests. Water-stressed states would develop economic and political relationships with Canadian provinces that could supersede loyalty to federal American priorities. Regional cooperation across the border could create constituencies for Canadian policies within American political systems. This represents a fundamental inversion of traditional North American power relationships. Instead of Canadian provinces competing for access to American markets, American states would compete for access to Canadian resources. Instead of Canada adjusting its policies to accommodate American preferences, the United States would adjust its policies to maintain Canadian cooperation. The speed of this transition will surprise populations on both sides of the border because structural changes in resource relationships operate beneath the level of daily political discourse. Water agreements and environmental regulations generate minimal media coverage. Technical discussions about infrastructure development and regulatory frameworks occur in specialized venues that attract limited public attention. But the cumulative effect of these technical changes is revolutionary. Canada has transformed itself from a resource supplier dependent on American markets into a resource controller with multiple options and alternative partnerships. The transformation occurred through patient accumulation of legal authorities and international relationships rather than dramatic policy announcements or confrontational negotiations. By the time this transformation becomes politically visible through actual restrictions on American water access or explicit Canadian demands for policy concessions, the foundational work will be complete. Canada will possess legal authority, technical capacity, and international alternatives necessary to maintain leverage regardless of American pressure or retaliation attempts. This is how empires discover that their dominance has ended, not through military defeat or economic collapse, but through the quiet recognition that they need resources they do not control and cannot easily obtain elsewhere. The transition from abundance to scarcity, from independence to dependence, from dictating terms to accepting them. History records these transitions as inevitable in retrospect, but they feel surprising to populations experiencing them because the foundational changes occur gradually while public attention focuses on immediate political theater. The Canadian water strategy represents such a foundational change disguised as routine environmental cooperation. The economic mathematics of this dependency reveal why reversal becomes impossible once established. American water infrastructure investments over the past century total approximately $2.3 trillion in current dollars. Replacing Colorado River allocations with alternative sources would require comparable capital expenditure over timelines that American political systems cannot sustain. The infrastructure for continental water transport exists primarily in the northward direction, from American sources to Canadian processing facilities, not southward from Canadian sources to American consumption centers. Building the pipeline systems, pumping stations, and distribution networks necessary to move Canadian water to southwestern American cities would require congressional appropriations exceeding $400 billion spread across multiple decades. These projects would cross multiple state boundaries, require coordination between dozens of regulatory agencies, and face environmental opposition that has successfully delayed smaller infrastructure projects for years. Meanwhile, Canadian water remains essential for American agricultural and urban systems that cannot pause production while alternatives are developed. The regulatory complexity amplifies Canadian leverage because any major infrastructure project requires Canadian cooperation at multiple levels. Environmental impact assessments must include Canadian watershed effects. International treaty obligations require binational consultation on water diversions. Trade agreement provisions mandate Canadian approval for resource extraction projects that affect shared ecosystems. Even if American political systems could maintain funding and political support for massive infrastructure projects, Canadian governments retain veto authority over the approvals necessary to proceed. Corporate responses illuminate how private sector actors adapt to structural power shifts before political systems acknowledge them. American companies have begun establishing Canadian partnerships to secure access to water-intensive production. The cumulative effect of these decisions creates economic integration that makes policy separation increasingly difficult. Canadian businesses understand this dynamic and have positioned themselves strategically to capture maximum benefit from American corporate migration. Provincial governments offer regulatory streamlining for American companies establishing Canadian operations. Tax incentives encourage technology transfer and intellectual property development within Canadian territory. Labor policies ensure that job creation benefits Canadian workers while providing American companies with access to skilled personnel and reliable infrastructure. The result is economic integration that serves Canadian strategic interests while creating constituencies for Canadian policies within American corporate structures. American companies with significant Canadian operations become advocates for stable Canada-US relationships and opponents of policies that could disrupt their access to Canadian resources and markets. Financial markets have begun pricing these dependencies into corporate valuations and risk assessments. Credit ratings for municipalities and water-stressed regions now include water supply security as a material factor. Agricultural commodity prices reflect growing premiums for production in water-secure regions. Real estate markets in southwestern cities show increasing volatility as long-term water availability concerns affect property values and development financing. Insurance markets provide perhaps the clearest signal of how financial institutions assess long-term risk. Premiums for agricultural crop insurance in Colorado river-dependent regions have increased substantially. Property insurance for large-scale development projects now requires water supply assessments extending decades into the future. Business interruption insurance increasingly excludes water shortage scenarios from standard coverage, requiring separate policies that reflect the growing probability of supply disruptions. These market signals operate independent of political recognition because financial institutions must price risk accurately to remain viable. Political systems can deny or minimize resource constraints, but insurance companies and bond markets must account for actual probabilities or face catastrophic losses. The divergence between political discourse and market pricing reveals the extent to which foundational realities have changed despite limited public acknowledgement. The international dimension of this transformation extends beyond bilateral Canada-US relations to encompass broader shifts in global resource relationships. Other water-rich countries are observing Canadian strategies and adapting similar approaches to resource management and export policies. Brazil has introduced legislation requiring government approval for large-scale water exports. Norway expanded regulatory oversight of freshwater resource development. Even traditionally, export-oriented resource producers are reconsidering policies that prioritize quantity over strategic leverage. This represents a broader pattern in resource geopolitics, where abundance no longer guarantees influence and scarcity no longer guarantees vulnerability. Countries controlling essential resources are learning to maximize strategic value rather than simply maximizing export volumes. The Canadian model demonstrates how sophisticated legal frameworks and patient strategic planning can transform resource assets into permanent geopolitical advantages. The timing of this transformation ensures maximum impact because it coincides with multiple other pressures on American strategic planning. Climate change intensifies resource constraints while requiring massive infrastructure investments. Demographic changes increase demand for water-intensive services while reducing the tax base available to fund alternative supply development. International tensions require increased defense spending while reducing resources available for domestic infrastructure projects. These converging pressures create a strategic environment where American policymakers must choose between competing priorities without sufficient resources to address all simultaneously. Water security competes with military modernization, climate adaptation, and economic competitiveness for limited budgetary resources and political attention. Meanwhile, Canadian water resources remain available immediately if American officials accept Canadian terms. The mathematical certainty of this outcome cannot be overstated. American water demand will exceed reliable supply within the current decade. Alternative sources cannot be developed quickly enough or cheaply enough to close the gap. Canadian resources represent the only viable solution at the scale and timeline required. Canadian approval of American access requires accepting Canadian terms on trade, environmental policy, and resource sovereignty. The elegance of this transformation lies in its inevitability disguised as routine governance. No dramatic confrontations, no ultimatums, no violations of international law or treaty obligations. Simply patient construction of legal frameworks that give Canada control over resources America needs. The transformation occurred through documents that seemed boring, frameworks that seemed technical, and partnerships that seemed routine. By the time American officials recognize what happened, reversal will require dismantling legal structures that serve legitimate environmental and sovereignty purposes. Challenging Canadian water policies would require arguing against Indigenous rights, environmental protection, and national resource sovereignty. These arguments would fail in international forums while damaging American credibility with other allies who face similar resource management challenges. This is how power transfers between nations in the modern era. Canada has achieved such control through 18 months of technical work that most people never noticed. The precedent established by Canadian success will reshape international relations for decades because it demonstrates that sophisticated legal strategy can overcome traditional power imbalances. Countries previously resigned to subordinate status now understand that alternatives exist. The international system built on assumptions about permanent hierarchies faces challenges from nations that refuse to accept their assigned positions. Future historians will mark this period as the moment when resource geography began determining political geography, rather than the reverse. Military power, population size, and economic output matter less than control over inputs that others cannot replace. The Canadian model proves that patient strategic thinking can transform resource assets into permanent geopolitical advantages that traditional powers cannot counter through conventional pressure. The transformation occurred so quietly that most participants did not recognize its significance until completion. Technical negotiations about environmental regulations became the foundation for fundamental shifts in continental power relationships. Legal frameworks designed for resource protection became mechanisms for resource leverage. International partnerships presented as economic cooperation became instruments for strategic independence.